I never want the podcast to be relevant. And by that, I don't mean the actual definition, something that's timely, that connects with people in a way they can actually use in their life here and now. What I mean is the online media sort of way, where it's chasing a trend, chasing the current thing, chasing the news story of the moment in order to gain more clicks and views. Now, this week, the episode that I've been planning and working on for several weeks now happens to answer several questions about two high-profile murders that we've seen this week. The assassination of Charlie Kirk and the stabbing and death of Irina Zarutska. It's ideology. It's ideology that we need to talk about. And we need to go beyond labels like the left. Because the left didn't do this. Frankly, the left is in disarray. They're having a civil war among themselves as different ideologies are battling it out. And it just so happens to be that the dominating ideology that's come about is one that's encouraging violence, but in a much more at the root sort of way than the overt calls. And we need to be clear about our Neopagan culture and what it is doing to people. Let's get into things. Welcome to the TLDR Christianity podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that by going to the Give, Send, Go or the Patreon linked below. If you would like to get a hold of me, you can always leave a comment if you're on a platform that allows comments, or you can email me at tldrchristianity@gmail.com. That is also included in the description. I really appreciate all your feedback. I really appreciate support. I really appreciate anything. I appreciate criticism. I like to hear what people have to say when they disagree with me. It's an important marker for understanding your relevance on a topic. If no one is willing to offer pushback, then did you actually do a good job communicating? Did you do a good job getting the message out there? So what are we talking about this week? As I already said, we're going to be talking about neopaganism. Now, what does that mean? Well, we'll get into things because, as I said, it's ideology that's leading to some of the violent events that we're seeing. You know, how do we go from radical progressives or give peace a chance hippies to radical progressives are now murderers or enabling of murderers? And how did the hippies, the give peace a chance hippies, grow up into this? It doesn't make sense. The actions we're seeing out there in society don't make sense. Whether it's, again, these murders, or it's many, many other things. How we're treating other people, specifically from the social justice side of things, how they're treating people, the contradictions that exist there, people believing in their truth. You know, I have my truth, you have your truth. How does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. It violates any sort of idea of well, just common sense. And that's what a lot of people lean back on. They go, whoa, common sense is going to win out in the end. I don't know if you've read the Bible, but humanity's story is one of running away from common anything. And by common, it means the things that are normal, natural, always there. The truths that are common sense is the truths that are common to all people, all times and all places. It's really an appeal to God's truth. And there's nothing that people hate more outside of Christ than God's truth. they're going to run from it unless they submit to it and they submit to Christ. But we need to make sense of this. We need to have a framework for understanding the insanity. We need to be able to make sense of the senseless, because there is a logic to it. It just happens to be one that's disconnected from reality. Now, this is not a new theme to the podcast. You can go years back, had a couple episodes with Dr. Bill Roach, where we discussed these ideas of my truth. He brings up modernism, something we're going to talk about here. He discusses standpoint epistemology, something that we're going to talk about here as well. And I'm going to break down these things a little bit. You're going to get a lot of terms. I want to give you the fact that there's a history so that you understand how things progressed. But it's really going to be the conclusion that is the most important part. And the conclusion is neopaganism. Again, I'm going to explain what that means. And it's going to help you, again, make sense. You can look at some of these things. You can look at why and how we could be so radicalized in this country to basically start to standardize, normalize assassinations of people we disagree with. And that's going to cut through the political spectrum because it's going to affect all those outside of Christ. In fact, people who know Christ are still being affected by some of these ideas, and we need to understand that in order to decondition ourselves. So let's do a little bit of an ideological history. For anyone who's more familiar with these ideas, yes, this is going to be a radical simplification of things. I'm even going to use some terms that are not standard, but use them for the sake of this explanation to help condense things and get through it quicker, and hopefully make things a little bit more obvious at the same time. So we need to talk about truth, how people understand truth, and the dominant narrative of truth for our time. As I said, I'm going to argue that it's currently neopaganism. When we go back far enough, you get to things like postmodernism, modernism, pre-modernism. Now, pre-modernism, that's where we're going to start. That is a more loose and generalized term. And what we really need to take out of there is simply the idea of Christian truth, biblical truth. What am I saying about that? Well, again, this is not a formal philosophy, unlike some of these other things we're going to look at, but loosely speaking, when we're talking about that here in this discussion, pre-modernism is talking about the idea that absolute truth exists and it can be known. Man can know reality as it is. So, what is absolute truth? Absolute truth is any truth that's true for all people at all times, at all places. Unchanging, immovable truths. These ideas that are constant. They're not subjective in any sort of way. They do not change over time. Things like logic. Things like morality. And I mean, you can just go through the entire list of the attributes of God and you're going to find absolute truth there. But the point is, it's those unchanging things, the things that cannot be moved, cannot be shaken. But not simply that they exist, we can know them. That mankind can know objectively reality. We can look out at reality and not simply make observations, but know it. We can know the world. We can go to our Bible and we can know truth definitively. Now, that does not mean that man will always arrive at truth. We are stupid, selfish people. What do stupid, selfish people do? They insert their own opinions. But we have the ability to know truth as it is. Another characteristic, man is under truth and man is judged by truth. Again, We're talking biblical here. We are under truth. In this case, we are under God, his truth, and we are judged by that truth. Okay, you got that? Good. Now we're going to contrast that with modernism. So modernism begins with a phrase you might have heard before. I think, therefore I am. It's one of these clear delineations where we can point to it and say, that is the moment when this belief system is birthed. Now, some people will still change the date of when modernism truly starts, but this really is the point upon which this idea called modernism is birthed. Now, if you don't know who said that, that was said by Rene Descartes, and he would launch, essentially, that statement, I think, therefore I am. I am a point of certainty that I cannot doubt. This would light a fire for what is called the Enlightenment, which is really the sort of mid-17th through the 18th centuries, 1600s into the through the 1700s. And this is really kind of the starting point of this modernism. Now, what does modernism mean? Well, I'm going to break it down into two phases, and I think you'll pretty rapidly grasp why. But again, we have the Enlightenment, which is all about rationalism. You might have heard the phrase Enlightenment rationalism before. And it's really, again, the basis of modernism. But the modernism that you're going to be more used to, you might be more familiar with, is going to be the secular age. The secular age, the post-revolutionary secular age. Now, I'm not talking about the American Revolution. I'm talking about the French Revolution. And this is very much a common point for saying that's the end of the Enlightenment. When these Enlightenment ideals, liberalism, classical liberalism, wins out in its revolution, violent revolution that ignites all these other wars. It changes things ideologically. But then we have this secular age, the 19th and 20th century, the 1800s and 1900s. And modernism, I love this. Modernism is full of contradictions, which is funny because it's supposed to be all about hard science, especially the secular age. Hard science. Everything is measurable, reason. It's full of contradictions. Even in its rise and fall, it is a contradiction. Because modernism both peaks and dies with the militant new atheists of the late 20th and early 21st century. Now, here's where it's kind of funny, because we're getting into the 21st century, but I said it dies in the 19th century. And in fact, it dies in the the 20th century. It dies in the mid-20th century. So how are we getting people in the late 20th century and the early 21st century that are the pinnacle of an ideology that's already passed? Well, we're going to see that. When we talk about postmodernism, you'll rapidly see how that works. For now, we're talking about academics, people, the smart people in the world of academia. These new atheists are people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. It's the height of debate culture with atheists and theists debating and these intense things. And it's almost turned into a sport to a degree. But there's this degree for how militant, aggressive these atheists are. There's this degree of willingness to debate. Why? Because they still believe that there is truth out there. Now let's start to define that. What defines this modernism? What is the ideology of truth, the epistemology of modernism? Well, it's that all truth can be found through unaided human reason alone. I think, therefore I am. I am a point of certainty. And through my reasoning ability, my thinking, I can find all truth. Now, it's fascinating because René Descartes, who unintentionally unleashes this upon the world, his pupil, Blaise Pascal, immediately notices the issues with where this is going to lead. And it's fascinating to read some of his writing, philosophical works, apologetics works, because he did a lot of mathematical works. Oh my goodness, if you're into mathematics and physics, you've heard of Pascal. He also invented modern transit, which is another fascinating thing. The first bus system can be rightfully attributed to Pascal. So when people have made this joke, if he would have lived to a reasonable age, we'd be in flying cars. Well, yeah, you can see why they would say that. Brilliant mathematician and interested in transportation. So, all truth can be found through unaided human reason alone. This secular age, the second phase of modernism, was dominated by scientism. It was the era of the religion of science. Secular humanism, atheistic evolution, the dominating force. And it was a very semi-empirical, what I can use my five senses to understand. And I say semi-empirical because they felt very comfortable stealing from other branches of philosophy whenever needed. Whenever needed. In fact, we're going to see this as we get into postmodernism. People calling this out very early on, too. At least very early on into the secular age. Modernism will say that absolute truth exists, but it cannot be known absolutely. Compare this to a biblical view. Absolute truth exists, they agree on that, but one says, and can be known. The other says, modernism says, it cannot be known absolutely. Now, the irony that people like to point out is that's an absolute statement. And if the statement is true, then it is an absolutely true statement. It's contradictory. It's contradictory. In order for them to make these foundational claims that are bedrock, solid, unchanging, they would have to be absolute truth and they would have to be known absolutely. Again, what does that mean? Well, one of the functional results is it denies absolute truth. And thus, it will always collapse into postmodernism. One of the reasons that the era between the two, when one starts, when one ends, gets fuzzy, is because this idea that that absolute truth can exist, but you can't fully know it. You can only know about it. You can only know a portion of it. Will always collapse into more doubt of truth. Now, previously, if it was man can know reality as it is, now it becomes man cannot know reality as it is, only as it appears to be. The subjective... Now, I know there's at least going to be one person out there confused on this, so I'm going to explain this. In our ability to know reality as it is, we have that ability. But again, that does not mean we will reach that point, or reach the point of truly understanding an absolute truth. Because we as humans are, again, stupid people that like to be selfish, that like to insert our own opinions. That's where the subjectivity comes in. Where is the subjectivity? It's with me. It's not with the truth. It's with me. It's not with our ability to access truth. It's with me. I am the subjective one. Modernism places that subjectivity outside of the individual and says it's no. It's in our ability to access this truth. It is external to us. There is a barrier outside of us that we cannot cross. On the other side of that barrier is absolute truth, but on this side is only the observable truth. The subjectivity comes into play, not in me. Again, if you're familiar with people like Richard Dawkins, you know that he really does believe that he is beyond any subjectivity. So man, if previously it was man is under truth and man is judged by truth, now it is man is over truth and man judges truth. We don't define truth, but we do judge truth. Now, what does that mean? Again, it's an unsustainable position. It will always reject more and more truth until we are fully defining what is and is not true. It is an unstable foundation. But it's externalized that subjectivity and made man into a position of authority. Secular humanism, that an atheistic evolutionary man, he is the pinnacle of truth in reality. Well, again, that can never work. So then we have this thing called postmodernism. What modernism collapses into. Now, postmodernism is going to say that absolute truth does not exist and that truth is a construct. Now, there's going to be differing opinions on exactly where that or what that construct is. Is it personal? Is it my truth? Is it societal? Is it our truth? Is it a world consensus? What level does this happen at? Is this construct created at? Now, if you know anything, you know the popular thing nowadays is individual, my truth. But then we sort of come together in my truth conventions, where different, often contradictory positions will form alliances with one another against rival truths. It gets confusing fast, but we need to make sense of this. Postmodernism is also going to say that man shapes truth through his experiences. There is no reality as it is. Or you could possibly just go further and say there is no reality. We are a boat sailing through the sea of time, and we create ripples. And those ripples are what our truths are, our experiences are. They impact others. And through that, we create a web of... Okay, I'm sure you've heard something similar-ish to that. That's the sort of idea we're talking about with postmodernism. Also, man is over truth, judges truth, and defines truth. Now we're at the point, since we've rejected any idea of absolute truth, we've reduced truth to a human construct defined by our experiences, defined by our perspectives. Man now defines truth. Man is fully God at this point. He dictates, judges, controls, creates truth. This is the ideology of emotionalism, of existentialism, of socialism. And yes, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. It's developed in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So as the secular age is just getting started. The height of modernism, of the true hard science modernism, which is ignited by men like Darwin coming on the scene, and finally these Enlightenment rationalists who hate God can plant their flag in something and they say, see, we don't need him anymore, and starts to become more accepted as evolution spreads. But basically, as soon as the scientific revolution of the mid to late 19th century is happening, you're already getting postmodernism started. Why? Because it's inevitable. Modernist views are always going to collapse. They cannot be maintained because they have no foundation, despite claiming to have one. So it's going to crumble over time until you're left in a postmodern state. It creates a vacuum. It was very intentionally, whereas other ones spread through the academic world. This was much more intentional and targeted at the common man. Again, look at thinkers like Marx. What was his point of focus? Was it on the elite, the educated, the schools? Well, he wanted to change schools. We'll get to that. But no, it was about the common man. The common man. And he thought that's where this ideological breakthrough was. The revolution was going to come. It's the common man. It's a popular change, not an academic, an elite change. And so these ideas get injected into much more grassroots levels and start to make serious changes. And so it rapidly, cancerously replaces modernism throughout the 20th century. And we really see it break into the mainstream. Obviously, it's already there. It's already causing damage. It's already in society. But we really see it gain this sort of mainstream dominance as sort of a worldview rather than simply kind of an isolated thing or pieces that people are picking up in the 60s and 70s. It's the hippies. And if you're not sure that the hippies are postmodern, well, I don't know how to help you because that's not a disputed claim. Out of all of these, that's the most obvious conclusion that we can reach is that they were employing postmodernism. It was a rebellion against everything, all authority, all truth. Everything was up for grabs. Everything was new. Everything should be tried. Everything should be encouraged. But then contradictions come in, except for those certain things that are bad. It's bad to be a square. But even before it hits the mainstream, it has to be injected somehow. And one of the biggest injectors of postmodernist thought is going to be John Dewey. If you followed the podcast for any length of time, you might have listened to my episode on the modern education system and how it has Marxist origins. And again, some people think that's a radical sounding claim, but you can go read people's thoughts and opinions, specifically Dewey's, who was not, in any sort of sense, simply just a classical liberal. He was very much a socialist, very much influenced by the ideas of Marxism, ideas that we would now call cultural Marxism, although he's not connected with the Frankfurt School. He's kind of a rogue. It's fascinating in terrible ways. If you haven't listened to the episode, you really should go listen to it, The Marxist Origins of Modern Education, where I give you a lot more information about Dewey, comments from Dewey about these changes. But he makes massive educational reform, radically redefines how education is done in this country, how teachers are trained. If you know anything about educational history and training. You might have heard of normal schools. Dewey is really the death of normal schools, which were all about practical training for teachers, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, about getting, by and large, getting a society to a base level of economic education. Now, these people know the practical things about how to conduct trade, business, how to handle their own personal lives and affairs. The education that you need, reading, writing, and arithmetic. You can read, you can write, you can do math. This is going to be valuable for you, and it's also going to be valuable for creating an economically active and vibrant society. He changes it to the emotional, the sort of emotional education that we do nowadays. Social emotional education. If you don't know, Dewey was doing this over 100 years ago, in the early 20th century. And the more you learn about his methods, his ideas, his thoughts, the more you see, oh my goodness, like, what we're doing right now was set up by this guy over 100 years ago. And certainly it took time to filter through, but through significant funding by the Rockefellers, because of course, it's funny how, there's the joke of blame the Rockefellers for everything, but it's funny how often they do just pop up places. But through generous funding and giving him a school, a university, University of Chicago, to set up his education training, he creates this new model of education and of training teachers. And then he goes and replicates it at Columbia. And then it begins to spread. Also, if you don't know, this is sort of an aside, society was fascinated with communism, socialism, and all sorts of related ideas in the United States in the early 20th century. They were all the rage. And there was a time back then, 100 years ago, when it really did almost become very similar to what we're doing now, where it's becoming one side is Marxist and the other side is a coalition of liberals and conservatives. That almost happened 100 years ago. It did rapidly fizzle out, and we won't go into all the reasons for that, but you see this postmodernism going after the people. And you see this change start to occur over time. Again, it targeted popular level change the people, not academic. Even though Dewey was making academic changes, it wasn't to change the way that the elites were thinking, to change the way that the academics were thinking, to change the minds of already established college professors. No, it was to change the future of, rather than convince someone who's already in a position, why don't we just target the kids? Why don't we change them? Make small changes here and there and get the ball rolling. And it worked. It really did work. And again, that's where that fuzziness comes in. But I'd really say the 60s were when society, by and large, changes from any pretense of being modernist to postmodern, even if there's multiple generations of academics who are not there yet and are slowly dying off. That's where you get a fossil like Richard Dawkins, who really becomes the pinnacle of modernism at the same time he's living in a postmodern world. And now that postmodern world, this Neopagan world, hates him. He's having to defend things that 30 years ago, he hasn't even changed what he says, but it sounds different because of how things have changed. But he's defending things that 30 years ago, people would have been like, Wait, what? Again, he was actually defending those things. But he didn't have to be overt about certain agreeances with Christianity because they were common sense. Common sense. So let's talk about neopaganism. I hope you've been sticking with me because this is important. We finally made it to neopaganism. Again, I really wanted you to see history of developing thought, get a little bit of a foundation, understand just a little bit that, hey, we were at one place where truth was solid, and here's kind of the story of how it eroded. There's so much more that could be said about that. That was the most broken down version of it I could give you. But let us talk about neopaganism. This could also be called spiritualism, new spiritualism. Not really new age. It's kind of past new age. The spiritual but not religious. And that's a big, big, big phrase. I'm spiritual but not religious. And you hear that a lot from the secular humanists, from the atheists, from the evolutionists, the people who were the main force in modernism, big part of postmodernism. Now they're suddenly spiritual again? Well, again, go listen to that episode on Dewey, and you'll hear that, yeah, he wanted a, quote, evolved religion. He didn't see religion as a bad thing. He saw it as a good thing, a tool to be used. And we needed an evolved religion. Now, neopaganism is largely an extension of postmodernism. Or perhaps you could say it's postmodernism's inevitable state. When it's worth looking at the two separately, and that's why I want to do it. But it's sort of when you create a vacuum, spiritually speaking. This is what modernism did. It tried to remove the spiritual from everything. And then in postmodernism, we're suddenly freed from all truth. Well, then why not bring the spiritual back in? And certainly you see things like New Age and the spiritual aspect of hippies and crystals and all that sort of nonsense. But this is something different because you see more like, I hate to say it this way, but like normal people, at least normal by the standards of modernism, people that adhere to this hard science view of reality, but at the same time, they bring in a spiritual aspect, and they're still denying truth, but then sort of like saying that there's like hard facts, but at the same time, they deny facts. It makes no sense. It hurts your brain when you try and engage with these people. But that's why you need to understand where they're at. You need to understand this thing. It's really a synthesis, to a large degree, of much modernist thought with postmodernism. How can that be? Well, it doesn't make sense. But compared to postmodernism and modernism, neopaganism does have a bit more of a foundation to rest on, because it's more collapsed and it's brought back in the spiritual. Basically, we're back at a pagan understanding of things where, if you don't have an answer for it, well, spiritual. Except in this view, it's not supernatural in the way that we as Christians would see supernatural. It's almost a natural supernatural. There's a lot of appeal to something. You kind of go, well, what's the something? Depending on the person, it might just be, oh, well, tell me if you heard this one. Oh, well, science will give us the answer in the future. Wait, so you're making conclusions now based on something you assume will be proven in the future? Yes. That's weird. Or maybe it's someone who's rationalized an extrasensory perception of things, but it's brought into science. Oh, it's just an aspect of reality we don't yet understand. It's a blending of materialism. All we have is here now. The material, that's it. There's no extra dimension to reality. And it's blending that with the supernatural. Oh, well, it's just sort of this extension of. It's certain things we don't know. It makes it malleable, compatible with almost anything and everything. And it allows it to adhere to science, to hard science, by then just filling in any gap it ever wants. Whether that's a defense of, well, that's my truth, or that's a defense of, well, this is this sort of spiritual aspect of things that we just haven't fully fleshed out yet. It's amorphous, but in a way where it can fill gaps and keep itself going. It's weird. Let's explain this a little bit more and get into a little bit more details. So, neopaganism really is, as I said, a revival of man's spiritual nature, taking everything that modernism and postmodernism kind of collapsed into, but then bringing back in that spiritual. Now let's talk about secular neopaganism. Neopaganism outside of Christ. This really starts, or can be pinned on, if not starts, another statement, or more of a sentiment, by, what do you even call him? I guess we'll just say philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who had this idea that God is dead and we have killed him. Therefore, this death of God meant the death of God's truth. That everything, and he's writing in the late 1800s, dies, I believe, if I remember right, it's 1901. And he's taking what he's seen. He's taking Darwinian thought. He's taking Marxist thought. He's taking other thinkers, and he's going, yes, but you people are relying too much on God still. What did I say about modernism? It's plenty happy to bring in other ideas where needed to try and fill in its gaps. And Nietzsche says, no, you can't do that. If God is dead, everything dies with him. Everything we believe dies with him. Everything is up for grabs. And the only way to succeed, to move forward, is with the rise of supermen that will replace the dead and destructive, in his opinion, dead and destructive soft values of Christianity with their own hard values. As he called them, the Übermensch. Now, if you're a student of history at all, your ears probably just perked up for a very different reason, and yes, it's related. Let me finish this thought, and we will talk about the connection of the Übermensch to the mustachioed man you're thinking of. Through this, the Übermensch will guide humanity to liberation in the new stage of human evolution. The Übermensch are both a people, as in there should be literal men that step up and impose their hard values, but it's also a goal. Humanity doesn't just seek the rising up of a group of Übermensch. Humanity wants to produce the Übermensch. And again, that should be sparking your attention. This goal, this Übermensch, is in direct competition with liberal egalitarianism, which weakens men, according to Nietzsche. So we're already seeing that liberal egalitarianism, classical liberalism, which has barely been alive at this point, is already seen as the enemy. And classical liberalism really is the dominant idea, politically speaking, and sort of socially speaking, of modernism. So even right when it's barely got its feet really going, French Revolution is where liberalism finally takes hold and then ushers in the secular age. And then not even a century later, we're already identifying it as humans are already identifying it as the problem. Now you might recognize some of these ideas, both the whole everything surrounding the Übermensch, and yes, the Nazis really liked Nietzsche. Nietzsche did not like the proto-Nazis. He died before the actual Nazi party started, but he did not like men who'd go on to start the Nazis. And there's lots of weird things with him because he was legitimately going insane. He died insane. That should not surprise you, but there are a lot of things going on and a lot of weird things that happen. Basically, it comes down to he wants the Übermensch to prioritize different things, whereas the Nazis prioritize genetics. That the Übermensch are going to be the perfect Germans, the perfect Aryan race. And that's not how Nietzsche wants it to happen, so then he says it's not legitimate. Oh, these people are just silly, though, because you can't say it's not. It's 100% an application of Nietzsche's thought. Mixing it with everything that Nietzsche also stands on. Evolutionary thought, Marxist thought. The Nazis just saw all this and said, wow, if we package this together, we can have power. We can control the country in a way that previously people couldn't. We can enforce our ideology. We can create a new religion. We can mold a new man for a new age. Yeah, you can see how it's just perfect for them. And you can also see, and this is what bothers me, is we got a display. We got a display of all these ideologies in action in the Nazis. We got a display of neopaganism. And if you do not believe the Nazis were neopagan, then we will go down another rabbit hole, but we will save that for another time because their religions, whatever you want to say. Yeah, very much. I mean, openly combined German paganism into things. And they were seeking to be the Übermensch, exactly what Nietzsche wanted. They were combining all these other ideologies. We got to see this in action. And it wasn't good. We've also got to see communism in action and see, oh, wait, that doesn't actually work. That ideology just collapses down into dictatorship. And very violent at that. No matter what branch of thought it erupts into, and then you look at classical liberalism. Its first real application, French Revolution, violence, death, and then the rise of a dictator. None of these ideologies, it seems that without God, violence, death, and dictatorship are the norm. Let's continue on a little bit. Moving on from Nietzsche. So, neopaganism, secular neopaganism, is always going to mix evolutionary thought with more traditional paganism. It's, as I've already said, it's an evolved religion for an evolved man. It's just what Dewey wanted. It seeks the ascension of mankind, the next stage, the post-human, as some call it. The Übermensch. It's literally the idea we're talking about. This should be very familiar. Satan in the Garden, Tower of Babel. These were attempts by man to elevate humanity to a new level. It sees God as, whether God is real or just a concept, it doesn't matter. Neopaganism doesn't care. It doesn't believe in truth that way. So if God's real or concept, doesn't matter. He's evil and an oppressor of mankind. Satan, as real or just as a concept is a liberator. And that's, again, that's a whole theme could chase down. The modern movement traces its roots back to the eugenics movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. Yes, there's a lot going on during that time. With the rise of evolution, there was a lot of thought about, oh, well, if this is true, then certain people are more evolved than others. So maybe we can influence that through selective breeding and culling of humanity. If you don't know, the Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was a eugenicist, and that was one of her goals with Planned Parenthood. And it was very racist. She wanted to eliminate black people. But these eugenics movements were seeking to develop this post-human state. Over time, this would develop into what we now call transhumanism, which isn't just, hey, selective breeding, experiments, killing of people. No, now it's going to be technology. We're going to use technology to ascend, break the bonds of the physical, and achieve a new state of existence. You see this. It's so popular in media. Just as a few examples, you have Star Wars, which has both just general, more spiritual post-humanism and also transhumanism using technology to ascend people. You have certain ascended masters that can come back from the spiritual realm, this ascended state. You have the show, or the whole franchise, I guess, Stargate in the 90s and 2000s, which had a race of ascended humans. And that was humanity's path, was on this path to ascension. You have Star Trek, which again has both ascended beings and transhumanist. Battlestar Galactica, Babylon 5, 90s and 2000s, full of sci-fi shows loving to do this. But you can go back further. RoboCop, even further. 2001: A Space Odyssey. What about The Matrix? A lot of themes in there. Avatar, Blade Runner. You can go into the realm of video games. Very popular there. The series Deus Ex, BioShock, Halo, Metal Gear, Assassin's Creed. You can look at comics. Both Marvel and DC are just flooded with these ideas. Super, super popular thing right now. Warhammer 40,000. Incredibly popular across all forms of media and just absolutely dripping with these ideologies. You can look at authors like H.G. Wells. You can look at the Dune series, Altered Carbon. You can look at religions. There are entire religions that fit into the categories of these post-human ascension states, mixing of the material and the spiritual for the benefit of mankind right now, with promises in the future. You just have to submit. Scientology, Mormonism. Hey, if you're a good Mormon, you're going to ascend and get your own planet one day. These ideas, these secular Neopagan ideas, are inseparably intertwined with evolutionary thought and Marxist thought. This is sort of, you have that period in the 1800s where all these ideas are spreading out. And now what we're seeing is a reconvergence of these ideas. A blending where they couldn't previously blend like they are now, they can in a neo-pagan society. Because the spiritual is allowed, the truth has been thrown out, everything's up for grabs, we can make whatever we want. So you have these ideologies. So when we talk about things like social justice, critical race theory, woke ideologies, all this stuff coming from a Marxist worldview, You can see it traveling along the views of truth that we've been looking at, and how easily it is for it to flourish in a neo-pagan society. A neo-pagan society, a secular neo-pagan society, is going to see God as the oppressor of mankind, the ultimate enemy, the ultimate one that we need liberating from. I mean, Amazon just put out an entire super demonic, literally, gross series about this idea of Satan being a liberator and God being an oppressor. God just wants to keep us down. God just wants to keep the demons down. When we need liberating, they need liberating. Everything wicked is able to be brought in. So you have this religious aspect, which is going to give, people are then going to give their devotion to it. You have this evolutionary aspect where we're trying to ascend, not in the crystals and it's the hippie sort of way in the 60s, crystals and drugs, sex, and rock and roll. No, now it's we can evolve ourselves. We can evolve to the next state. We might even evolve out of physical limitations, become pure thought energy. And people legitimately, there are thinkers that talk about when we reach this state, whether it's through technology or evolution, pure evolution, when we reach this state, what should the consequences be? How should we behave? How should we treat the lesser advanced humans? All sorts of thoughts. And again, the Marxist dynamic of oppressor oppressed is always there. You can see it through all of this. The need for the common man to overcome his oppressors and become something new. Rise up, achieve the next state, achieve utopia through evolution, through liberation, through revolution. And that's where we get to things like political commentators being assassinated, women being brutally murdered from all indications just because of her skin color. Oh, well, the guy was unstable. Yes, he was. Because he's been raised in a neo-pagan way, in a society that's told him that he is oppressed, that there is no such thing as truth, that he is simply molecules in motion, that he evolved from monkeys, that there's nothing special about him, yet at the same time says the spiritual's okay. So he has these tensions within him. So yeah, he's going to be messed up. Very, very messed up. Incredibly messed up. And this is the result. As we reinforce these neo-pagan ideas, as we get further and further, as Nietzsche wanted us to, further away from any foundation, any idea of God, anything that God brings with his existence, then we're going to see people more and more willing to act on these wicked ideologies. We see someone like Charlie Kirk. He's an existential threat to their entire religion, to their entire neo-pagan religion. And neo-paganism, it's what we've been raised in. If you're, basically any of you at this point, unless you were, in a much more rural area that took more time to get infected with a lot of these ideas, and there are a lot of people like that, you were raised in a neo-pagan society. You were raised with all these assumptions. Now, again, the more neo-pagan aspects are newer, but you see how the postmodern people, really, again, going back to hippies, They felt just completely at home, switching from free love, give peace a chance, to kill those who challenge my ideas. Why? Because they're challenging their religion. Why? Because their religion is this Neopagan idea that mankind can evolve, can ascend, but there are certain people holding us back. That they need to rise up, have a revolution. The Ubermensch need to lead the way. That's why they'll give their devotion to anyone that speaks sweet words to them that align with their ideologies. They want a Hitler. They don't want a Stalin. A Stalin doesn't bring the religious with him. A Stalin doesn't bring the he doesn't bring the ascension with him. He doesn't bring the promise, the right promise of a future. They want a Hitler, someone who brings in a much more encompassing ideology that tries to satisfy the whole man. It's terrifying. Which is why we've seen almost like a leap away from simply the progressives of 30 years ago to these radical, woke people. Because it's a religion. Now let's super briefly, if that's what you wanted, you got the episode here. That's the big concluding thoughts, was just about secular neopaganism. Now I want to talk a little bit about Christian neopaganism. And you might think you know what this is, but it goes beyond. And something we need to look at. I want to put a thought out there. You might have seen multiple news reports that, Gen Z is starting to become this very Christian generation. Now, if you look at the actual stats that they're trying to quote, it doesn't really say that. It more just shows that they might be coming to Christianity. What is actually Christianity by these reports' definitions, but they come to Christianity at larger numbers than like millennials, a famously lazily anti-everything generation. Is that the case? Well, some of you might be going, yeah, you're right. There's Christian neopaganism, and we're seeing a lot of Gen Z get swept up in the super hyper charismatic movements, full of radical existential emotionalism, where they're looking for a certain type of experience. Now, I'm not just talking about, for the people that are going to misinterpret what I just said, I'm not talking about your Pentecostal church down the street that preaches the gospel, yet believes that the gifts are active. I'm talking about the cults. I'm talking about Bethel Church. I'm talking about your prosperity preachers. Now, again, that's an old school one. That ain't cool anymore. No, you want the much more experiential ones, again, like Bethel, that are giving people this radical spiritualism that they can see that you have these actions to do to sort of like, I'm doing this, therefore I'm experiencing the spiritual. There's gold dust being pumped in. We're experiencing the spiritual. And it goes beyond simply just music and lighting and attitude. And you watch videos of these sorts of groups and seeing the sort of unhinged nature of things, of the experientialism. But it's not just that emotional side. And yes, that's capturing lots of people. We need to fight against that. But we need to not turn a blind eye to the other side and realize that you look at all these numbers, hey, there's not just this charismatic side that's stealing people. There's another one. People want the same satisfaction, but they're finding it in a more reverential place. So you're seeing a lot of conversion to Catholicism, to Orthodox groups, where they're seeking that experientialism in that reverential sort of way. They want the buildings, the vestments, the smells, the bells, the rituals, the mysticism around everything, the pagan sort of experience of things, yet structured and ordered. It's the people that want the safety of a strong wall, but they want all the same experiences inside of it. But it goes beyond that. I'm going to give you an example that'll really help clear it up, I think, in just a second. But it goes beyond simply people converting to non-Christians converting to Catholicism and Orthodox. But you have many young Christians who see errors in Catholicism and Orthodox, and they go, okay, I want these same sort of spiritual experiences, but I don't agree with those groups. So I'm going to go to a high church Lutheran or Anglican group, and we're seeing a lot of growth there as well. But there have been, you can talk to pastors among those groups. The really liturgical ones, that's where they're going. They want the experience. And you talk to them, and I've known one pastor who's basically said they want me to stop preaching and they just want the liturgy. That's it. Sort of tongue in cheek, but I've seen that same sentiment expressed several times. These people don't know hardly anything about the Bible or Christ, but they love the experience. They love the experience. They've created they're living in a subjective world, a postmodern framework for truth. But they want the spiritual. They want this Neopagan experience. So they go to something so they can just feel the spiritual. Now, again, if they're legitimately a Christian, they might be going to like an Anglican church or something. And then you'll find out that they're now existing with a lot of tension in their life because they are getting validated by the spiritual experience, yet they have no foundation, or they're in contrast to their foundation. They're actively stepping against their foundation because they're growing not in the Lord, but they're growing in experience. Now, I'm not bashing Lutherans and Anglicans here. I'm just saying those are the two that have the sort of high church, the high church segments of them that people are going towards. And again, you can talk to some and find that they realize their problems. Now, I have serious disagreements with both of those groups. But if, they're preaching the gospel, they're still preaching the gospel. Serious disagreements that we do need to talk about, but I'm not going to attack someone if they're here in the gospel. So it's not to throw them under the bus, like, oh my goodness, someone's going and converting to Anglicanism. That means they're not. No. But they live in a tension because they're not rooting themselves. They're not there to honor God. They're there to satisfy this cultural neo-pagan desire that's been injected into them that they need to fulfill. Now, let me give you an example. Okay, if you still don't fully understand what I'm saying, we can talk about King James only. The radical King James only cults. I'm not talking about someone who likes the King James. I'm not talking about someone who, a church who say, no, the King James is the Bible we use, and we're not going to use another one. I'm talking about the radical ones who will anathematize anyone who doesn't use the King James. The true cultic King James only. They want a physical experience of the spiritual to validate their belief. It's the same thing we've just been talking about. Now they're doing it with a physical book. This is a special, a mystical book. Not the Bible in general, but the King James. That we can ignore history, we can ignore any sort of facts. We can look at this one and say, this one is somehow in English, a different version of English than they speak, and they're not even reading the same as the original. They're reading updates. This thing is where we put our I mean, it's funny. It's where they're putting their trust, their hope. They've created an idol. And if you go and you read Exodus 32, I believe verses 1 through 5, says, now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, come, make us a god that will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Aaron said to them, tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. Then all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took this from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Now when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. And yes, in the Hebrew, it says, to Yahweh. They did not abandon God to bring in this idol. Now, there's debates whether that idol was supposed to be a physical representation of Yahweh, of God, or if it was supposed to be a god alongside Yahweh. Doesn't matter. The point remains. The issue is there. They made an idol. They put something physical, this experience, thing they can experience in front of God. Yet they kept God there. This is what the Christian Neopagans are doing. They might want some aspect of God to remain. They might even be saved, yet they're seeking out this experience. They're seeking out their own golden calf. They have to have that there in order to validate the spiritual side of themselves, because this is what their neo-pagan ideology has told them. Now, we're not immune from this. If you've grown up in this, you're going to have these same tendencies to one degree or another. And understanding that is critical towards fighting against it, towards having a good and proper mindset. And there is, this episode's gone on long enough. I have more than a few notes on the positive side of things about how we should ground ourselves. We need to ground ourselves in the Word of God. We need to know that we were raised in a neo-pagan society, or, you know, if you're over the age of 30 in a more postmodern society, yet at the same time, it collapses into neo-paganism, you're in the same boat. That's what you were raised with. Your mind, to some degree, is going to feel comfortable in that. The only way to get you out of that is to get rooted in real truth, to get rooted in a correct view of truth, to get rooted in God's Word. And not just in a, I know about God's Word way, but no, this is the guiding principle for understanding truth. If you want to know why Charlie Kirk was just assassinated, You have to understand the reality of our neo-pagan culture. I hope this has been useful. This is a massive introduction. I'm going to leave a link to a talk that I believe is super useful and helpful for understanding a lot of this, although it's still just a segment of things. But I hope this has been useful, giving you some context for understanding the irrational, making sense of the senseless, putting some legs onto things that previously you looked at these people and go, I can't comprehend it. I can't comprehend anything about your view. Now you can go, okay, I understand it. This is consistent with your view of truth and reality. This is consistent with how you process the information that you're receiving. It's irrational, but it's irrational because it's disconnected from reality. You have your own logic within it, though, so I get it. I get your religion, your political beliefs, your view of society, because it's all this one blob that's pushing you in the same direction. Again, we could spend the next dozen hours talking about just certain aspects of this. This was just to give you a baseline. I hope it's been helpful. Please let me know your thoughts. Give me some feedback. What are you thinking? What could we dive into more? What would be helpful to dive into more? Again, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that by going to the Give, Send, Go, or Patreon linked below. You can also email me at tldrchristianity@gmail.com. God bless you. Look forward to another episode next week that probably be a little bit different than this one. This has been fun, but definitely need a break after trying to condense so much into so little. But remember, God's been so good, so very good to us, so go bring glory to his name.